And then at 9:30, which is the time that I thought, right, I need to check, I stood up, and at the same time Matt stood up.
No, you stay.
Matt and Rachel were actually staying in the apartment next to us, 5B.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until...
Hello and a warm welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. It really is a shame that the Tapas group and the MCCANNs didn't report for duty to Portuguese law enforcement and perform a reenactment of the night of May 3rd as they'd been asked. By the way, if you're of the opinion that they'd never been asked, here it is in black and white that they had been asked. It's a shame because had all 9 turned up, you probably would have seen the silliest performance of Jack-in-the-Box musical chairs, not just musical chairs, Jack-in-the-Box musical chairs, and what's more, performed by adults, not just adults, adult doctors you'd ever seen. And I've just done a poll on my channel, and 99% voted that they wouldn't use the system these supposedly intelligent doctors used. Only 1% voted for this random, ineffective way of checking. Remember, there are 9 adults, and among them, they said they were doing checks either at 15, 20, or 30-minute intervals. So among the group, there's certain parents who were checking at 15-minute intervals, another group checking at another parent unit that were checking at 20-minute intervals, and then another one, guess which one, checking at 30-minute intervals, but all starting at different times. Now imagine this. Imagine a dinner where just one person gets up and leaves every 15 minutes over, let's say, a 2-hour period. That's 8 departures from the table. Meanwhile, someone else on the same table is departing 6 times. There's also someone else departing 2 to 3 times, and then also visits the restroom and talks in the road for a period. And this scheme is apparently happening every night. If it's still difficult to imagine, I highly recommend BBC One's Crime Watch reconstruction. I'll put a link to it in the description. The reconstruction dealing with the checking kicks off at about the 12-minute mark. The dramatization literally shows a continuous stream of adults getting up from the dinner table, leaving, and then returning only to prompt someone else to get up and leave. Now, let's remind ourselves why these constant jack-in-the-box checks were necessary to begin with. Firstly, because the tapas bar was out of earshot if any of the children were crying. So because you can't hear them crying and you're not at the apartment, you've now got to go there periodically to find out if they are crying. And so it's necessary to physically move closer, walk closer to make sure. So any discussion that it really wasn't far away is basically self-destructive if you have to leave wherever you are to physically check because you aren't able to monitor the situation from the restaurant, neither audibly nor visually. Secondly, it was necessary for each family member to check on their children because the group had decided, I mean, can you believe this, that each parent would check on their own children. If they'd simply coordinated their efforts and had each person check on all the children, they could have cut down the number of people required to do these checks by around 2/3. It wouldn't have been a very efficient system, but certainly a lot more efficient than the system they had. Thirdly, if the children weren't sedated, then it would be necessary to make sure they hadn't awoken while a set of parents had left the rooms completely, because in theory, anything could have happened every 10 minutes. Now, of course, having a lot of people jack-in-the-box all the time makes it possible for them to actually witness the abduction, doesn't it? If you didn't have everyone running around, it makes this opportunity to see an alleged abductor unlikely as well. Of course, in a situation like this, the converse is also true, at least hypothetically. If any or all of the children were sedated, or there would really be no need to check on them frequently or even at all. Before we get to the rest of what made these checks so ludicrous, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're enjoying this analysis, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's continue. So the ludicrous thing about these checks isn't so much that one parent is getting up constantly, but that effectively all of them are, which makes it an incredibly daft system to begin with. And as I say, I've polled my own community, and only 1% they would have chosen this system. 99% feel that there was a more intelligent way of doing this, and of those, most felt that using the hotel's babysitting service just made the most sense, and I agree with that. Now, some might think that because doctors came up with this strategy, it must have some hidden genius built into it. Perhaps a radical new system where you get to exercise and work up an appetite even while you're having dinner. That would make a little sense if the group hadn't been exercising all day as it was, playing tennis, jogging, in some cases sailing. What really doesn't make sense is that the Ocean Club had 16 childcare workers on duty. You know, the property specifically offered a child babysitting service as it is. Now, according to statements in the PJ files, if I understand them correctly, one worker, Leanne Danielle Wagstaff, said or seemed to suggest that if guests wanted to, they could ask the staff to look after their children from 7:30 to 11:30. And the impression I get is that is individual looking after. I could be wrong. And they say, however, Madeleine's parents never did this, although the service was free. Now, the McCanns say they didn't want a babysitting service, they wanted a listening service instead. According to the Daily Mail, in an article dated 23 April 2008, so just less than a year after the incident, quote, a spokesman for Mark Warner said today that the McCanns had known there was no baby listening service at the resort when they booked their holiday. So almost a year later, this was still a big deal in the media. Now, if the Tapas 9, the McCanns as part of this group, if they found the creche facilities, let's say, substandard or unreliable, someone else who used them in May 2007 felt otherwise. And this difference of opinion is really fascinating. Quote, the McCanns' choice to leave their children at the flat and make regular checks is surprising, given the alternatives. This is a comment made by someone else who was there and who was familiar with those alternatives. They go on to write, in their defense, they may have been expecting, as advertised in Mark Warner brochures, a listening service. But staff told us the service has been discontinued because the apartments were too spread out. The resort, however, offered a babysitting service for €15 or £10 an hour, which was staffed by a member of the daytime nursery teams or a dining out club. And it's this service that 2/3 of you, 65%, elected to use if you were in that situation. It's also what the person who wrote this account did themselves, what they used themselves. And it does make sense, doesn't it? So these are intelligent people. Why didn't they make use of the service? The article goes on to note, this would involve parents dropping off children at the creche where they would be supervised, watching videos until they went to sleep. Parents would then return before 11:30 p.m. to scoop up their sleepy offspring, as I think Dr. Julian Totman did. So it seems the free service mentioned in the PJ files wasn't free after all, unless I've misinterpreted it. The article goes on to note, I can imagine the McCann's dilemma. The dining out club was more than a 5-minute walk from where the McCanns stayed, along cobbled streets or a winding pedestrian path through the apartments. Well, a 5-minute walk isn't really that far, but it is quite far if you've got 3 children. But let's hold on a second here. If the entire group were happy to make multiple sorties to their respective apartments and back, some as many as 8 different trips, or if split between 2 parents, 4 at the most, that still seems like a lot more get up and going than a single trip to the creche. The article also points out that it's not far. It worked brilliantly for us on most nights, but it would have felt much further if you had to ferry 3 children there and back and hope they were asleep after doing so. Now, you can imagine if the McCanns had to transport 3 sleeping children as opposed to 2 or just 1, that could be and that would be pretty daunting. I have mentioned, although the distances aren't great, even short routes from A to B in Lewes can involve significant ups and downs. That was my experience when I was there. Again, that might not be too much for fit 30-somethings walking on their own, but carrying children, especially in each arm, well, that would be quite demanding. The article goes on to note, quote, plus parents were required to wait until children under 2, which includes the McCann's twins, were asleep. We talked to parents who said this aspect was enough to put them off the option. So in what way were the McCanns unique in terms of the entire group that included the other doctors with children? Well, although there was one other couple where both parents were doctors as well, the McCanns had 3 children and also a pair of very young children. This probably did make things harder on them than on anyone. Can you see in this scenario, sedation would or could certainly make sense, certainly from a practical point of view? Do you also see that among the entire group, the parents who checked the least, with the greatest time gap, and also the member with the longest absence, was Madeleine's father? In their statements to law enforcement, both Jerry and Kate said that they would normally check every half hour, whereas others said that they routinely checked either every 20 minutes or every 15 minutes, as crazy as that sounds. The other thing that's interesting is there's some common testimony that of all the people who went to check, and bear in mind with Jerry and Kate, it was the longest distance between checks, to aggravate that time spent away, Jerry visited the restroom and also spoke to someone on his way back. And so you had Diane Webster saying, I think in my original statement, I thought maybe Jerry wasn't there. And there was also talk of someone ordering a steak and there being a plate that had not been consumed. And you can imagine with this whole jack-in-the-box and constantly getting up to check that at least one person would probably have food ordered and then arrived at the table, but they're not actually at the table. Now, we know from even what Diane Webster says that she was also curious and concerned and noted that the twins, these are her words, the twins were still asleep in the cot, and with all the noise going on, I don't know how they slept through it all. So I think it would be interesting to know if any other children in terms of the group failed to waken after Madeleine went missing as well. Was it just the twins? And if so, why? How can one explain that? Okay, so there never was a reenactment done for the cops. How did that help the investigation? How did that impact the investigation? Do you think it impacted it positively or negatively? If you say negatively, how negatively? Well, listen to this. As it turned out, for about 5 years, the Metropolitan Police basically took the Tapa 7 scenario at face value, all of it, the timeline, the Tannerman sighting, and so they based 5 years of investigation essentially on a bogus lead. Then in October 2013, investigators announced they were adjusting the timeline of the incident to later in the night, corresponding to a second sighting at around 10 p.m.
It's possible Madeleine was actually abducted later than you had originally thought, which makes other sightings later on now more significant than they were previously.
Absolutely correct, and that is where our focus is now.
I don't know about you, but that officer reminds me a lot of Johnny English, certainly looks similar to him. What do you guys think? But it turns out that after 5 years, when they kind of thought about everything a little bit more carefully, they decided to focus more on the second sighting that occurred around 10 p.m. And so how do you think the failure to do the reenactment impacted the investigation? one might say in the same way that the McCanns and Tapas group didn't deign to use the Ocean Club services when most people would, and then something bad happened, they as a group apparently also didn't deign to do a reenactment when the authorities asked them to, also where perhaps most people would. And what happened? This set the entire investigation back 5 years. It's an interesting waste of time and resources because the McCanns have a constant refrain. Almost every time they give an interview, you hear them saying every moment spent accusing them is taking away critical time that could and should be spent searching for Madeleine. But one also has to wonder, in a group with a preponderance of doctors, how could they make such a poor choice of a checking system and then something went wrong anyway? And then in terms of the investigation, how could they make such a poor choice again not to aid the investigation in such a critical area? And then what happens? You have a disastrous waste of time that goes on for 5 years when so much could have been gained in that period. And so it begs the question, were these silly mistakes? Were they mistakes of ignorance? Were they accidental? Were they innocent? Or by design? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.